Thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation having me here. I'm happy to talk to you on the neuroethics of brain-hardware interfaces, and Eric basically gave an excellent talk to neuroenhancement. I won't go into the enhancement issues of neurotechnology, so I want to focus my talk on clinical aspects and the neuroethics of clinical aspects of brain-hardware interfaces. The neuroethics, I try to divide into three spheres. The clinical neuroethics, research neuroethics, and theoretical neuroethics. This is some kind of arbitrary, and there's a huge overlap, much more than in this picture. But I think it's good to remember in which sphere you are in the current debate. In clinical neuroethics, of course, the topic is clinical application of drugs, or in this talk, technologies. Research in neuroethics is about the research, development of these devices, and getting them to therapeutic applications. And theoretical neuroethics is the philosophical and ethical basis of all these discussions, and even more questions about identity, human nature, and something like that are based more here. And of course, they have applications in this and this. And also, the ethical approach is some kind of, in the first place, a bit different. If it comes to clinical neuroethics or clinical ethics at all, the main focus is on the benefit of the patient. And if it comes to research neuroethics, the main focus is of gaining knowledge, and of course also protecting participants. And theoretical neuroethics provides, again, the theoretical basis for this. And these three spheres, I want to structure my talk. I want to start with clinical neuroethics, and then come to research neuroethics and theoretical neuroethics. And I want to frame my talk about the topic of responsibility in clinical applications, and clinical research, and even in theoretical neuroethics, in case of responsible communication of these kinds of technology. It might be a bit similar to Eric, not to overestimate what can be done with these interventions. So clinical neuroethics, there are a lot of questions which can be addressed in this kind of applications. Of course, risk and complications, side effects, patient selection, quality of life, and the benefit for the patient are important questions in this area. I want to focus on responsibility and autonomy, and responsibility for someone else, and liability. And I want to talk about neurotechnologies like brain-computer interfaces, brain-machine interfaces, and also of deep brain stimulation. As you are neuroscientists, I suppose you know much better than me what's about these kind of technologies. So I want to focus on the ethical questions and go not into the technical ones. So first, responsibility for someone else. For brain-computer interfaces and brain-machine interfaces, one aim is to restore communication, or another for directing prosthesis. You see in the upper right, Jens-Paul Herman, who is a quadriplegic, and she learned to direct a robotic arm, you see here, just with her thoughts recorded by invasive electrodes in 2012, I guess. And she was able to grasp and direct her arm, and even self-features with a chocolate bar here. That was what she learned. This is a prosthesis. Restoring communication is usually done in locked-in patients who cannot move anymore, not even arms or yeah, they had, sometimes there is some blinking left, and these patients may benefit from technological implications, recording brain signals and using these recorded signals to direct a spelling device and therefore to communicate with the environment. All these applications are meant to strengthen the autonomy of these patients. They should enhance their self-directed interaction with the environment and, in the end, improve the quality of life of these patients and following even their spouses and their relatives. In the case of responsibility, we have a responsibility to care for these patients, even might be in the direction of brain-computer interfaces. And we can ask question, what is the concrete responsibility of a physician, of a caregiver, and relative? Especially in the kind of, in the case of spelling devices, the question is what kind of questions should we ask these patients? And maybe we, later on with the minimal conscious patients about this more. Should we use these devices for small talk? This would be nice to have, but even we are in a clinical situation where we where we want to know more about this patient and their situation, and we can even ask about therapeutic decisions or their situation. Do they suffer pain or something like that? And then we can adjust our treatment for these patients. And most frequently get discussed in the ethical literature is the question, should we ask these patients end-of-life questions? And of course, end-of-life question is quite common in clinical medicine and medical ethics. Before these patients have a BCA, the situation is like any other end-of-life decision with any other patient in the clinic. Any medical intervention requires consent. Ethical justification is the benefit and the benefit for the patient and the consent of the patient, or if the patient is not competent, the legal representative. So we need sufficient information. What is the case with a BCI? I think in the end, it's in principle the same. When these devices work and there is reliable communication. This is a mere if. So, and then the question is the patient competent? And is the patient competent and the devices work and can provide a reliable communication? Then we have no reason to make special thresholds for our decisions and questions we ask to these patients. But the reliability of these devices and the communication is not that sufficient that many ethicists and clinicians agree that we should ask end-of-life decisions for these patients, because if there is an error or a misinterpretation of the devices or the results of the devices, the decision we make is not reversible anymore. So the question of liability again goes to brain-computer interfaces, brain-machine interfaces for controlling prostheses and wheelchairs, and the second issue on deep brain stimulation. To start with responsibility and brain-machine interfaces, we again have a robotic arm. The technology behind, there are neurosignals recorded from the brain, and these recorded signals are computationally processed. And then prognoses are made which kind of movement the patient wanted to make. And these prognoses are correct for up to 85%, I guess, which is good. Jens Herman learned to control the robotic arm quite fluently, but not as good as our natural arm used before. Nevertheless, accuracy of 85% means there are 15% left. And what does it mean if the prognosis fail? Who would be responsible for actions based on erroneous interpretations of the recorded signals? Just remember, brain signals are recorded, then computationally processed, and the robotic arm in the end is directed by a computer based on neural recordings, but in the end it's directed by the computer. Who is responsible for erroneous interpretation and when something goes wrong, harm is caused, or something is destroyed? And this is an ethical question and also a legal question. I think Jennifer may come in more detail from a legal perspective in the afternoon. There are different answers to this. You can say, okay, if the engineers constructed a device which has errors, then the engineer, of course, is responsible for this. On the other hand, when the patient knew about this accuracy of 85% and the inaccuracy of 15% and accepted to use these devices nevertheless, knowing that there is some kind of gap of reliability of these devices, wouldn't this be in the responsibility for the patient then? This is, in this case, an interesting question, but we know these questions from other technologies, more or less dangerous, or even not so dangerous, like a parking assistant for your car. If you imagine buying a new car and you are offered a parking assistance for a few hundred euros or dollars, and you're told, okay, this parking assistant is accurate to up to 85%. Well, I would say, okay, just work on it a bit further before I accept this. The question would be the same. If the parking assistant says, okay, you have a lot of space there, go ahead, and you do that and bump into the car behind you, who is then responsible? The constructor of the parking assistance system, which said there is enough space to go ahead, or you who was driving the car and trusted the parking assistant. Parking assistant, we can easily drop it out and learn to park our car ourselves. But if you don't, if you're not able to move your arms or legs, you might accept a bit more uncertainty about the prognosis in this case. But we use cars and other dangerous devices, and we have obligatory insurances. When we want to drive a car in the public, on public streets, we have an obligatory insurance. People need to make driving licenses or something like that, and maybe this could be a social approach to these ethical questions around the use of brain-machine interfaces in case of quadriplegic patients. And of course, restrictions in the application and the use. Of course, if there is this huge uncertainty, we won't allow patients with brain-machine interface to direct a plane or a passenger plane or a bus or something like that. But this is not the direction of use nowadays. We are happy if we can help these people in everyday life to grasp something to drink, and they are not reliable on the carer that much in these days. So taking responsibility and autonomy from the recording devices to stimulating devices, I want to present a case of a 45-year-old male patient. He had a 12-year history of Parkinson's disease. He received a bilateral stimulation in the subthalamic nucleus. Before the stimulation, before the surgery, he had no history of criminal behavior, no psychiatric disorders, depression, or mood fluctuations. The adjustment of stimulation parameters took 2 months after surgery. He had significant motor improvements and a reduction of levodopa from 3,600 milligram to 800 milligram. This is what the physician, the neurologist, wanted to achieve in this patient. The patient himself reported no adverse effects, which is good, and mentioned he felt more awake and alert. However, his wife reported that the patient had broken into a parked car into the middle of a crowded street. He was unable to explain why he did this. He remembered that during this incident he felt over the top and invincible. He did not feel anger while breaking into the car. He did not feel any stress about the resultant upcoming court. So the patient reported everything is fine, no side effects, but the wife reported, okay, something is wrong. In this case, the physicians adjusted stimulation parameters, and the feelings of invincibility faded away in 3 to 4 days, and he became appropriately anxious about his court proceedings, and even his motor functions further improved. There was no further hypomanic behavior reported over the next 9 months. Okay, everything is fine in this case, but from an ethical point of view, you can ask some questions. What if the patient would have refused to get the stimulation parameter adjusted? Would we have to accept this as an autonomous decision, or would we have to coerce this patient getting the stimulation parameter adjusted? And who was responsible for breaking into the car in the first place? If this kind of behavior faded away after adjustment of the stimulation parameters, is this evidence that it was not him breaking into the car, but he is some kind of directed and by the stimulation device? And some of my colleagues for these questions argue we need advanced directives for these questions. Before surgery, patients should consent that they agree that stimulation parameters are adjusted if needed. And we need advanced, we know advanced directives from different fields of medicine and even in other sections. However, informed consent usually means that it can be taken, you can step back from it. Even in the middle of a surgery, if you're awake and say to your physician, I don't want this anymore. And if it's safe, the physician has to stop the surgery. And even in research settings, if the clinical trial is going on, you always have the opportunity to say, stop this, I want to drop out of this. And this is true for this too. If you agreed in advance to get the stimulation parameter adjusted, and afterwards you say, no, I don't want this anymore, you have to accept this decision of the patient when the patient is competent. The central question is, in this case, is the patient competent to make this decision? And this is what this question is all about. If the patient is competent, we have to accept his decision, and maybe if he is a danger for himself or for society, we have to put him in a psychiatric ward, or if he wants to keep the stimulation going on.
Or the patient is not competent, and then we don't need to accept this decision, but we can adjust the parameters. So, and what do you think? Who is responsible for breaking into the car? It's not that simple. I don't know how this court decided on this case. But in the other, someone should have to pay for the damaged car. Who will do that? Probably in this case, at least in Germany, the insurance of the physician would have done this, would have covered this damage. I guess. At least I would have recommended the physician to try to get the insurance pay for this. But it's not obvious that this would be the case. Maybe, and again depends on information beforehand. If the physician told this patient that there might be changes in behavior, and the patient accepted to do this, maybe we should blame the patient too. At least, I guess in this situation, the patient is not fully responsible because of the signs that by altering the stimulation parameter changes his behavior. So we should consider at least an effect of the stimulation of on his behavior. To come to the second part, the research neuroethics, I want to restrict my considerations on clinical neuroethics, on clinical trials. There are obviously a lot of more questions on clinical on research neuroethics. I won't go into animal ethics or on non-human primate research, which are also huge ethical questions, but that would be another talk. Research neuroethics, I want to focus on experimental intervention in clinical traits. And we face an unavoidable structural dilemma in medical research. We need insights for effectiveness and safety of new interventions, and these are based on human subjects research. However, the risk for participants are taken seriously, contradictory to physicians' duty of doing no harm. Therefore, we have regulations for clinical research, a whole bunch of regulations like the Helsinki Declaration and a lot of other documents are going into regulations for clinical research. Emmanuel and colleagues had a look at these regulations and identified 7 requirements for clinical research. The research should add value. It should be scientific valid. The methods should be state of the art. Patients should be selected fairly based on the scientific objective. This is a point where in drug research often companies do the research in Africa or somewhere else, although the people undergoing the research won't even come near to receive the drugs when the trial was successful, but the drugs would be sold in North America and in Europe and industrialized world. So the fair patient selection means that patients who will receive the drug should be the ones who undergo the research. This is, of course, also a question of the risk-benefit ratio. And this fourth issue, it is meant that the risk should be as low as possible and the benefit as high as possible, and there should be a proportionality between both. independent assessment, we need an internal review board, an ethics commission. Informed consent is obviously important, that the participants understand what they are undergoing and consenting to in the trial. And respect for participants mean that there should be ongoing information for adequate medical care. The brain stimulation was and is established for a lot of neurological conditions like Parkinson's disease, essential tremor, and dystonia. It's also for obsessive compulsive disorder, and it's under research for many other indications, and not yet approved. And a major issue is treatment-resistant depression and other psychiatric DBS indications. The added value is, in addition to knowledge, treatment option for refractory patients suffering from refractory major depression, not treatable through other means. So scientific validity is we need a reliable hypothesis, or sometimes incidental findings may suffer. This is how neurological DBS got its place. It was in the end an incidental finding. And a fair patient selection, there should be severe suffering of the patients, and no other treatment option should be left. Risk-benefit ratio, we should include only refractory patients, and beginning with few patients, of course an internal review board, an external ethics commission, and the patient should be aware of the experimental character, and they should be competent to make this decision, and of course we need long-term monitoring and publishing of the results. This is just an attempt to specify these 7 requirements for psychiatric DBS. Going a bit deeper into detail for 2 aspects, the reliable scientific hypothesis. DBS works in Parkinson's disease and other neurological disease, so why would it work in psychiatric disorders? Some kind of incidental finding is side effects of Parkinson's disease are sometimes depression or hypomania, as we saw before. So there are also psychiatric effects of neurological DBS, and if it comes to a reliable hypothesis, if we have different hypotheses, we each may lead to a different research design. So some say overactivity in the Brodmann area 25 is a major issue of depression. We should target here with DBS to inhibit this area. And this was done by Maybeck and Lozano. Others say anhedonia is a major symptom in major depression, so we should stimulate the reward circuit, which is then the nucleus accumbens, and which was addressed by Schlepfer and others meanwhile. Andred identified 6 different main targets for major depressions, and we still don't know which is the best target to treat major depression with deep brain stimulation. So we have a lot of uncertainty going on here. So we should ask which target is appropriate for which patient, which is the most suitable stimulation site and mechanism of action is still unclear. This kind of uncertainty may lead to refrain from this kind of research. I think this is the wrong reaction. The uncertainty just emphasizes the necessity of the research. We need to gather data and hopefully evidence why this is the case, but uncertainty also stresses that we need to proceed with caution in this area. When it comes to therapy refractoriness, this is not well defined. So what does it mean that the patient is therapy refractory? Do we need to test all possible medications and other interventions before delving into the research with deep brain stimulation? I'm not sure about this. There are a lot of different drugs and other interventions, but maybe we can group these drugs together with a similar mechanism of work, and which is also not that much a problem, but we have to consider that therapy refractoriness is very context specific. Of course it's different over time, which kind of intervention should be tested, but as medicine improves and we have new therapeutic approaches, others have to be tested. But it's also context specific in case of the place where you are. If you are in France or in Europe or in Northern America, you have different therapies to test and to exclude before going into the research as when you, say, you're in Africa or in other countries. And even more, if you are in an industrial country, these context specificness will depend on each clinic in which you are. There are some trained physicians who are very good at some intervention, and other physicians are not that trained. So what I want to say is you have to take this context specificness into account for addressing therapy refractoriness. And some historical remark, therapy refractoriness was also supposed for lobotomies 100 years ago. But then alternatives often were not proven seriously enough. So before beginning a trial, you have to define which treatments should be failed before the inclusion of the patients. The final section, theoretical neuroethics, we can talk about free will, identity, personality, or a lot of other issues. I want to go into some anthropological implications and frame it in the terms of transfer of knowledge or responsible communication, as I said in the beginning. Transfer of knowledge, I want to begin with the cyborg, and I'm quite astonished sometimes when journalists contact me, usually via email. I want to talk to you to neuroethics, to ethical implications of this and that device. And we make an appointment, and then telephone rings, and the journalist just starts with, so let's talk about the cyborg. So what? This was not what I agreed to. But okay, let's start to talk about the cyborg in the ethics of neurotechnology. Cyborg means, usually it's a mixed term of cybernetic organism. It usually comes up science fiction, the Borg of Star Trek or something like that. And these are framed as a threat for mankind, or in the other case as superheroes. in scientific literature, the superheroes came later, and the threat for mankind is a bit earlier. What's true for both of these, the threat of mankind or superheroes, these are hybrids between humans and machines. And hybrids, they are in some case human and in some part machine. And they usually, these cyborgs are in many cases better than the humans. And that's why they can be a threat for mankind. Why? Because they have capacities humans don't have. But one crucial aspect of humankind they don't have. They don't have morality, usually. Cyborgs are impaired in moral behavior, usually. That's why they are constructed as a threat for mankind, or when they are better constructed hybrids, they can be superheroes solving problems of humankind. If you go into the Schwarzenegger-ish movies, it started with the threat for mankind, and then the Terminator develops to some kind of superhero who should preserve humans and the world. In the end, what's my main point and my major obstacle with this issue and this term, cyborg, does mean that a cyborg is not a human being. It's a hybrid between a human and a machine, but this means it is not a human being. And then the next question is, do we have moral obligations to cyborgs? Our legal system and also ethics is just usually framed on humans, or if it comes to animal ethics, we have animals and special ethics, but we don't have yet a cyborg ethics. So do we need a cyborg ethics? If we talk of cyborgs, yes. Moral obligations is one question. Do we have moral obligations to them? And the other way around. What can we expect from them? Do they have moral obligations, and or not? So because the cyborg puts the organism out of the realm of humanity, I hesitate to call someone who gets an electronic implant into his brain as a cyborg, because these patients are still patients and are still human beings. They behave like a human being. There are some examples, rare examples, like the one, the hypomanic broken into the car, that there are side effects and the behavior change. But I don't think this technology transformed this patient to a different entity than a human being. This is still a human being, and this means we can address our moral and legal questions to this kind of patients too. If we don't, we in the first place, we didn't, generally speaking, have moral obligations to these kind of patients. Well, this is a Borg from Star Trek. Therefore, I emphasize the responsibility of in communication, and to refrain from if you can, from the cyborg term. Of course, it's generating attention, but you generate also problems on the case of morality. But it's also the other way around. Responsible communication is not just with generating attention with fear or something like that, but also if you talk with of a miracle cure in deep brain stimulation. Deep brain stimulation is a symptomatic treatment. It's not a miracle. It's a huge intervention. It's a surgery. You implant electrodes and put current into the brain, high-frequency stimulation to a specific area. So it's not a miracle, it's an intervention, and it's not a cure, it's symptomatic treatment. So, and if you talk about a miracle cure, this may raise unrealistic expectations what can be achieved by this kind of technology, and this is impact on the, in the end, the outcome of the treatment, not in the sense of the neurological conditions and effects, but for the patient, what he expects and accepts as a benefit for this intervention. So in the end, you need to be aware that there's a difference between science communication, which scientists and researchers should do. They should communicate about their science and the research and the results. Science marketing is a bit different. It's like every marketing, some kind of advertising. And science writing, this is what journalists do. And science marketing is somewhere in between of this both. And it's much too easy, as I did it in the beginning, to just blame the journalists. They write completely crazy stuff just to generate attention. Often, these journalists don't have a chance to get the things really right, because the misleading phrases and results were not in the scientific publication, but in the press release. The press release is some kind of science marketing, and they sometimes overestimate the results, and the journalists, they don't have time to go into every original paper. They stick to the press release, and sometimes, and this is then the blame for the journalists, they just cut and paste the pieces of the press release to their science writing papers. So, is this a cyborg? I don't think neurotechnology transform people to cyborgs, as I already said. I think the best is to look at these devices as tools. Andy Clark, 2007, wrote, I quote, the typical human agent, circa 2004, feels herself to be a bounded physical entity in contact with the world by a variety of standard sensory challenges, including touch, vision, smell, and hearing. It is a commonplace observation, however, that the use of simple tools can lead to alterations in the local sense of embodiment. Picking up and using a stick, we feel as we are touching the world at the end of the stick, not usually as if we are touching the stick with our hand. The stick, it has sometimes been suggested, is in some way incorporated. Just a stick. And just imagine a hammer, using a hammer, you have to get used to it. Learning to ride a car or drive to ride a bike or drive a car, or even skiing. You have to learn it. If you train, and if you train it often enough, you somehow incorporate these kind of artifacts into your self-concept. And then you don't need to think, if I want to go right, which kind of movement I have to make. If you're trained, you just make the movement you need to go on the right side or the left side, and other things. The integration of tools relies on an active process and an independent protagonist. This is usually true for recording devices, which need training to get the things work, to move the robotic arm, and even to the spelling device. In stimulation devices, the technology actively alters electrophysical brain processes and neuroactivity. So the integration isn't that intentional and independent. However, we need some month of adjustment and getting used to this kind of technology. At least for the physician, deep brain stimulators are a kind of tool for treating the patients. For the patients themselves, they can put it on or off, but not much more. Humans are used to use technology. They are technology-using animals. And I think there is no transformation through this kind of technology. Also, through neurotechnology. DBS, brain-computer interfaces, brain-machine interfaces, intelligent implants, or how you call these devices, I think these are tools. And if we look at these devices as tools, we also have, I think, a hint for our moral and our legal questions. We are used for centuries and for being human, using tools and how to address the ethical and the legal questions. The expectations we had, unrealistic expectations on cyborg, miracle, and cure, and both have a therapeutic impact. If it comes to a miracle cure, patients may be disappointed about from a neurological point of view, successful intervention. With the case of the cyborg, if they fear to become a cyborg, they might not get a surgery or intervention which could be beneficial for them. So in the end, it would be good to have some kind of neuroliteracy in the public sphere for being competent, for deciding in one's own best interest with respect to neuroscience. So to come to an end, to conclude, brain-hardware interfaces can be a potential help for patients and improving their quality of life. And I think the best way to look at these devices are as tools. The ethical, legal, and social implications, I focused on autonomy and responsibility and the questions of knowledge transfer. And therefore, we need to choose terms carefully, not to raise unrealistic expectations or unfunded fears. So we need to be aware of the difference between science communication and science marketing. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for your talk, and now it's the time for questions.
I had, of course, to comment on that because I'm working on DBS in animal models and for psychiatric disorders. And one big thing that you were actually quite kind with us as scientists when you mentioned the science communication and marketing, because you seem to put the blame more on the journalist than on the scientist. But because of what has been already said during the first talk, because of the pressure and the context, scientists sometimes put high expectation in their results, and because of impact factors, we are under that pressure. We sometimes sell much better the result than they should be. And we have the pressure to go for medical miracle. And DBS has been sold that way, but sometimes also there is a miscommunication between the basic scientists and the clinicians. And for example, applying DBS for addiction was totally irrational based on the basic research. And they did it because they are seeking for the huge impact factor phenomenon in the medical journals. And the outcome is so low that actually they had to stop because they can't recruit patients if they aim the incumbents. So now we're working on different targets, and it may come out to be interesting. But there is also this big pressure so to take into account, and we have the responsibility. But working on animal models, sometimes the clinicians go a step further without waiting for us to get the results. So it's also something we really need to take into account.
Yep.
completely right. I didn't want to say, I didn't want to blame the journalist. My point was to emphasize that you as researchers have a responsibility for science communication too. And thank you for your comment on the pressure and the context in which these science and science communication and publication is taking place. And of course, there is some kind of not a scientific or a publication pressure that journals accept only positive results and don't accept negative results. And this is not good, of course, but who is the editor of the journal and who are the reviewers? In the end, it's you. So it's again within your responsibility.
Any other questions?
Actually, to follow up on that, but it's a bit divergent, but I think it's an important thing to mention, the notion of scientific bubble, that because of promise, it's not only publication, it's grants as well, to get grant. We are pushed to make promise that we know in advance we will not be able to fulfill. So HBP, Human Brain Project, is one excellent example of that, where we all know, everybody, even people in the HBP, that all the promises that were given will never be fulfilled. And a big issue at the end is the notion of scientific bubble that may explode as economical bubble exists. And if you have any comment on that, it would be good.
I think you're right, and we can go back even further for cancer research. We had promises that cancer would have been solved as a problem, as a medical problem, 20 years ago, which is not. Nevertheless, there was a lot of improvement in cancer therapy within the last 50 years. But you're completely right. The promises made in grants are some kind of grant lyrics, and everybody knows that. For this, in the perspective of knowledge transfer, it's not that important because this is some kind of internal within researchers. If it comes to the public, there we need to be more cautious about making promises. What can be achieved with this kind of intervention or technology, and just not to raise the expectations of the public and the patients and probably the future patient too high, and making them disappointed about a successful intervention.
Yeah. You mentioned the notion of cyborg and kind of dismissive as being a science fiction term, and I think it's more than that. When you think of transhumanism, I mentioned, I mean, Google is paying millions, if not more, of dollars to maintain the singularity universities, which the aim of the singularity university is to have a merging to create cyborg, and they have a huge publicity and big influence in all kinds of circles, including politics. So I think it should be taken more seriously and discussed more seriously than just being a kind of superheroes from Marvel. I think it's more than that, and it's a serious political and social question. It might be. I mean, there is a big hype around it anyway.
I think now, for now, right now, we don't have cyborgs. What will come in the future, we will see, and of course there are efforts for artificial intelligence and something like that, and of course we need to discuss this. But what I wanted to say is it's not helpful to address the current patients as cyborgs. This, I think, is not helpful today. And of course, if these are cyborgs or not, will, philosophically speaking, depend on your definition of a cyborg. If a cyborg is a human being implanted with some kind of technology subcutaneously, then of course DBS and invasive brain implants create a cyborg. But does this help for this notion? And then in the end it comes to the crucial discussion, what is a cyborg and when a human being would be transformed to some kind of cyborg? What would it need? I don't think it's sufficient to implant some kind of technology. Andy Clark, I quoted, he talks of a human being as natural born cyborgs. All human beings are cyborgs because they use tools. So, okay, we can do that in a philosophical sense, but why do we need the term cyborg then? Every human being is a cyborg, so why do we need the term cyborg in the end when it's just, we can just say human being because we're using tools?
Too early.
I have one question. Back to your example of these PD patients stimulated in the STN and breaking through a car. So you were suggesting that maybe the medical doctors should share some responsibility. But would you say the same if the person was under the effect of cognitive enhancers, for example, so that matches with the first talk, and or if it was under the effect of alcohol, would you ask the guy selling alcohol to be sharing the responsibility? So it's really a big difference.
Well, I think it's a good example. Alcohol is a very good example. Alcohol has huge effects on your behavior. What's different to DBS, we know these effects for thousands of years.
No, I totally disagree with you on that point. And that was actually a part of my question I forgot, is that we exactly know what we don't know is the consequences of DBS stimulation. When we apply it in one patient, we can have totally different side effects. And so far, no one is able to predict which they are going to be, in which direction they may affect, even if it's in the same sphere. For example, motivational side effects or psychiatric side effects. For some people it goes up, and for some others it goes down. So we can't predict that. So it's really difficult to manage that and have a clear idea. Alcohol, we more or less know what could be consequences, although maybe really different as well. So we certainly know we can manipulate people by playing with our brain. So that's the scary thing with DBS. But to which limit we have the responsibility, it's really a big debate. And I'm glad you raised that example, but
manipulating human beings through deep brain stimulation is in the end a question of who should hold the remote to adjust the stimulation parameters. Isn't it? No. Okay. We can discuss on the break, or in the end. Okay.
I think we are quite delayed. You want to ask another?
We still have time for one question?
Last question.
Just to come back to the same question, the case you told remind me of a case that was reported of a person who had a brain tumor, and under the effect of the brain tumor, he got sexual impulses and he was condemned, and then they took off the tumor and he normalized, and he was still judged responsible because he had the capacity of reasoning. And the responsibility, I mean, Jennifer may talk about that later, legal responsibility is one of the schools that is based on the capacity of rational thinking of the person. This person was aware of what he was doing, so he should be judged responsible for the action he did, even though it was because of a well-adjusted DBL, but he was conscious of what he was doing, so he was responsible. I think
one important aspect, more to be responsible, he should have been able to do otherwise. And I don't know if he could have...
If you have a rational thinking, you may be judged as being able to do otherwise.
Well, this is what we usually think. We ascribe responsibility to hold someone responsible for his and her actions. And in this case, the brain tumor, it was, if it's the same case, I am aware of. When the brain tumor was removed, his sexual orientation normalized. Yeah, and I think this is a huge hint not to hold him fully responsible for this kind of behavior. In the end, from a normative point of view, it's important. Could he have acted otherwise? And if the person has this sexual orientation and could have just gone in a different direction or just refrained from harming other people, he would be responsible. But we would have to talk about what did the brain tumor do on this brain and his behavior in the end. And this is. I don't know if there is enough expertise in the physicians and the neuroscientists and neurosurgeons that they can, with accuracy, say, okay, this is the case and this is not the case. I don't know.